international relations theory and global leadership today. So sometimes when you're reading about a world event or something going on, you might get a very particular set of facts by an author. You feel like they're just feeding you objective facts about the world, and this one set of policy options is the only solution that can be taken. Otherwise, it's going to lead to all these crazy disasters going on. Then you might read a secondary article about the same issue and get a totally different perspective. Maybe peaceful options are possible, and those facts that you thought the author was giving you before start to look a little bit more like opinion. And it'll probably suggest a lot of different policy options that are possible based on that same case. So I'll give you an example. I wrote my undergraduate thesis on the dispute of the Caspian Sea, and I picked that topic because I read an article that was like, this is the next side of World War III. It is, it's going to lead to this massive conflict, and so of course, me being a debater, I was like, oh, perfect. I'm going to have a scenario that no one else is going to know about. It's going to be fantastic. But then, it turns out, as I dug a little bit more into the research and to different authors' perspectives on what was going on, it started to look a little less like the side of World War III and a little more like a stalemate, where nothing was really going to happen anytime in the near future, and there were actually quite a few cooperative solutions that were possible, and some that had even been tried, and others that were merely proposed. So, in order to really understand how different authors can come at these same sets of world events in such different approaches, that's only really possible to understand if you understand the theories that are underlying what they're saying, that can kind of predict and explain different potential solutions to the problems, and even understanding the problem. Those theories can lead to different understandings of that. So the goal of this discussion is not just to help you with debate, but also to help you in life. Many times when you have disagreements with your friends or peers about foreign policy or domestic policy, sometimes you're not going to be disagreeing about top-level issues. You'll have disagreements about the underlying philosophies. So hopefully getting a few different perspectives will broaden your perspective. Even if you don't agree with every theory, you don't have to. That's okay. And this will also help you critically respond to your peers and to the media and to politicians and things other folks are saying. So that's pretty much that. This discussion is going to I'll give you a brief overview of two major international relations theories and one social theory that's useful when applied to international relations. And throughout this discussion, we'll be talking about power politics, and hopefully we'll have a couple minutes to discuss the role of the U.S. in the international arena as well. I'll add as a caveat, I'm not an expert on this, so at any point, if y'all have things to add or things you want to contribute, feel free to do so. Also, these theories, there's a lot of different strains and different authors that maybe identify as a particular type of that perspective, so it's a little more complicated than what I'm going to lay out, but I'll try to focus on some of the major points that folks agree on in those major theories. Okay. So first, we're going to talk about realism, kind of the biggie. Realism is significant because it has been the dominant model of international relations theory for the last 6 decades. It created a framework for scholars and policymakers to understand the threats after World War II and plays a major role in political decisions today. Realism is a structural theory. Realism relies on the structure of the international system to provide a great deal of explanation for state behavior. It's also a material theory, as it argues that states attempt to gain material wealth, military progress, economic progress, those materials, in order to increase their positions of power relative to other states. So we're talking about structure and the structure of the international system, but what is the structure of the international system? These are things that exist around us, but we might just kind of take for granted. So first is that the international system is comprised of individual nation states, and these are the major units of actors that realists take to look at the world. Since the 1648 Treaty of Westphalia, the nation-state system is a major characteristic of the system, and these, like I said, these are the individual units of studies. So other factors like multinational corporations, non-governmental organizations, economic interactions, terrorist groups, all those things can play a role in states. But when you think of international relations theories, you're usually talking about states' behavior and how they interact. Realists also believe that states behave rationally, according to their own self-interest. States do not make random decisions or lack consideration for how actions may affect their interests. In debate and in life, frankly, people love to talk about how actors are irrational, how Iran is super irrational, how North Korea, they act rationally. Well, the two major international relations theories we're going to discuss today actually do believe that states behave rationally, so this is something that you can think about and apply to that in debate. But what is the fundamental interest that all states share? Security. And security, power, self-preservation, and relative gains are all wrapped up in this concept of security, and we'll break those down a little bit later. But basically, all states, they want to survive. That is the end goal. And so in order to do that, they have to have security, secure themselves from threats of others. So this interest of security is both created and reinforced by the primary structural characteristic of the international system. Any guesses to what that's called? No? All right. Cool. You're going to learn something. Anarchy. And I know when you see the word anarchy, your brain probably pictures a city of bustling people, craziness, everyone running around shooting each other. That's not quite what we're talking about here. Anarchy refers to a system that is anarchic. There's no central authority. In the international system, there's not a world police that's going to keep a country from invading you. There's no multilateral institution that can completely constrain the behavior of states. You're kind of on your own. Does that concept make sense? Anarchy, there's no global police. Whereas if something goes wrong in a country, there's at least a government or some structure to be able to deal with that. In the globe, not quite the same situation. And this is a problem, and this is a major contributing factor in the international system for realists, because this means states are pretty much at the mercy of their neighbors, which is not a great position to be in. So, if your main interest is security, and you're also at the mercy of those around you, what do? You have to secure yourself. You're responsible for securing yourself. And you have to always remember that the states around you, those are all potential threats to you. So states are in an inherently competitive situation already. This is called a self-help system. Basically, the states they're responsible for securing themselves because there's no global power that's going to be able to help them out. There's no world government to 911, my state's being invaded. Nothing that works quite like that. But here's the problem. In a self-help system created by anarchy, or power-driven leaders, depending on what type of realist you ask, your best interest is to be able to defend yourself, all right? We all got that so far? So you start increasing your military power. So you're like, all right, I'm secure, we are all set, we got our armies, they're badass, got some drones, we're good. But here's the problem. Your neighbor over there, they're looking over and they're saying, well, hey, what are you doing? What are you doing over there increasing your military power? We're in this anarchic system too. And we're responsible for securing ourselves too. And we don't know if you're going to attack us. So we're going to start increasing our armies. And we're going to get some drones and some tanks and some new weapons and all this badass stuff. But then you, on the other hand, now you're looking over at them. And what they took to have security against you, now you have to ramp up your escalation as well in order to counter that threat. So this problem is known as the security dilemma. And this, arms race might expand regionally or globally. And the security dilemma is the problem nations face when the actions taken to make one nation feel more secure inevitably make other nations feel less secure. Does that concept make sense? Yeah? Cool. So, in this way, does anybody watch The Wire? No? No Wire fans? I'm probably going to go over so well. Anyway, this character in The Wire, he says the game is out there, and it's either play or get played. And that's kind of a good summary for this idea of realism and the security dilemma, because for realists, countries are all out there trying to maximize their own security and ensure survival. That's the game. And since you're playing on your own in a self-help system, it's either play, ensure your own security, or be played, risk being subject to domination by another country, group, corporate interests, etc. So the security dilemma is really important. realists are also very concerned with gains in power relative to other states. These are known as relative gains. This is a neo-realist, John J. Mearsheimer, who's written a lot of international relations theories pieces, and he also wrote a book called The Israel Lobby with Stephen Walt, which is pretty cool if you want to learn more about the U.S. relationship with Israel. Anyway, so we're talking about relative gains. In every interaction between states, there are winners and losers. But some winners win more than others, and in interaction, some losers lose more than others. So, for example, say Iran all of a sudden got the full capability to have a nuclear bomb. They have a nuclear bomb. Well, in that situation, everyone probably loses a little bit in terms of security. There's miscalculation, and maybe an accidental launch could happen, and there's a new threat of a nuclear bomb being launched. But the U.S. probably would lose more than others, right? Because they have that power of the nuclear weapon as a bargaining chip, whereas hey, maybe some other countries, well, they don't have that nuclear capability, so yeah, they lose a little bit, but they're not losing quite as much as another country. So this idea of, some winners win more than others, some losers lose more than others. So when faced with an opportunity to cooperate for mutual gain, states aren't going to ask, will both of us gain, but they will ask, who is going to gain more in this situation? Because remember, they always have to keep in the back of their mind, state, you might be a potential threat to me, and we'll talk a little bit more later about how that gets played out. So now we're going to talk about the difference between classical and neo-realism. Classical realism is sometimes called humanist realism because it focuses on the flaws of human nature as the primary cause for conflict. And this partly stems from the religious concept of original sin. People are inherently flawed. Religious classical realist authors include St. Augustine and Reinhold Niebuhr. But there are also secular classical realists like Hans Morgenthau, Machiavelli, or Thomas Hobbes, who supported the argument that humans are deeply flawed, making conflict inevitable, but not necessarily based on religious reasons, not because, Garden of Eden and, eating an apple and all that bad stuff that happened. Has anyone read anything by Hobbes or Machiavelli, The Prince, the Life, and anything like that? So you can get that idea of, it's state of war, state of anarchy. And that's why conflict is inevitable. So it's focused on people. Those leaders who are greedy and lustful and want power are going to be expanding. That's humanist realism or classical realism. Now, neo-realists, who you'll probably read a little bit more of and applies a bit better to debate, focuses on the structural composition of the international system, basically what we just talked about. It relies on anarchy to explain the presence or absence of conflict. And as I said before, this creates the inherently competitive system, which makes conflict inevitable. Both of these groups are quite similar. They both have a pessimistic approach to interaction within the international system, as they think conflict is inevitable, and there is a threat of actors cheating, which we'll discuss in a minute, which would overcome any attempts to cooperate. Does that make sense, the distinction there? Cool. One more distinction we're going to make about realism, though there are plenty more we could make, but we'll talk about offensive and defensive realism. So defensive realists like Kenneth Waltz argue that the international system provides incentives for expansion only under certain conditions. Due to the anarchic system, states ought to generally pursue moderate strategies as the best route for security. Don't make yourself a target when you don't need to unnecessarily and it's not in your interest. Kenneth Waltz uses the balance of power theory primarily to explain this. So it's, again, the balance of power theory. And the balance of power theory predicts the pursuit of security by nations tends to result in the creation of balances of power on a systemic level. So states balancing each other out in terms of power relative to another. And eventually, this creates an equilibrium of power in the world. In order to prevent any one state from getting too much power, states will form counter-coalitions to balance this out. I think in the 16th century, an example was, England versus Spain and France. They would balance each other out. Then there's offensive realists like Stephen Walt and John Mearsheimer, who we just saw. Offensive realism argues that anarchy incentivizes expansion because only the strongest states guarantee they have a guarantee of survival. They are able to completely secure secure themselves because they're the strongest. So in order to have the most relative power, states should be heavily armed. They should pursue unilateral diplomacy. You need to have strong economies, expand territorially, and gain those material things. Again, it's a material theory. Basically, they should become a hegemon, either in the world or at least in their region. Although there's some debate amongst realists in terms of how other states would respond to this power. And Stephen Walt, he counters the balance of power theory with the balance of threat theory, which is a little bit different. It argues that nations tend to align against other nations, but not necessarily the ones that have the most power, but rather the ones that pose the biggest threat, right? So there are plenty of countries that, are powerful, but the intentions of what that state would do once they have that power come into play. So if they're not a threat, then we wouldn't be worried. So, the U.S., if we didn't, in some level, see China as a threat, we wouldn't need to have the Asia pivot. We wouldn't need to worry about countering them. So that's the distinction between balance of power, where it's just the most powerful state, we have to counter against them, versus balance of threat theory, which is only countering if there's a threat. And to help clarify this a little bit further, the balance of power theory predicts that lesser powers will eventually align against the U.S. just because you have the status of global hegemony. Whereas the balance of threat theory would predict that this alignment only occurs if the U.S. is viewed as a threat in the international system. Okay, so let's chat about how realism plays out in debate, because as cool as these things are, and as much as I think hopefully they'll help you when you're reading stuff or talking with your peers, we're here for debate after all. So these things get applied in debate in a couple ways. First, they explain why states go to war. A lot of these stories about how the system is inherently competitive and states need to get relative gains compared to other states. These might be internal link scenarios, or at least provide some evidence backing the analysis you do provide. Also, realism can explain why conflict is inevitable. And so, for example, if you're hitting a critique which talks about, oh yeah, world peace, blah, 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 well, world peace isn't going to happen if conflict is inevitable. And if you use some historical examples and use this theory of realism to support you, you can have a pretty compelling case for why that's true. Similarly, realism can provide explanations for why threats actually do exist. I mean, maybe y'all have heard or have seen or even run a threat construction or securitization type K. Well, the argument that threats actually do exist and are real, realism explains those pretty well, or at least underpins a lot of the explanations for why that's true. Realism also discusses why power and security are important. So, for example, reading a hedge or power projection advantage or disadvantage. And lastly, how perceptions of states' interests and power play a role in responses by other states. Are there other ways that's been applied in debate that you've noticed at all? It's kind of one of those things that underlies a lot of arguments. You'll notice your opponents making arguments along a realist train of thought, whereas they're not going to say, oh, hey, this is a realist argument. They'll instead say, China and U.S. war is inevitable, so better to go to war now than go to war later. And so try to keep that in mind. Try to categorize your opponent's arguments as they go, so that way when we discuss some other types of theories, you say, well, I might not know the specifics, but at least I know this theory, so I have something to counter it, and then you just have to generate more of those arguments. So that's realism. Any questions about realism? No? All right. If you think of any, we've got a small group, so it's all good. Feel free to just put your hand up, shout out, whatever. So next we're going to talk about liberal institutionalism. This is a strain of liberalism that talks a lot more about the role of multilateral organizations, but I also am going to be including in this discussion just general liberal ideas as well. And when I say liberal, I don't necessarily mean Democrat, the way we use that word in the U.S. as liberal versus conservative or Republican. But realism is kind of more of a negative theory, as opposed to think of liberalism and liberal institutionalism as slightly more of a positive theory. So first let's talk about what are institutions. You might also hear the word regimes used instead of institutions or rules. While there isn't a totally agreed upon definition in international relations, which makes things a little confusing, but a good definition is a set of rules that stipulate the ways in which states should cooperate and compete with each other. Or Stephen Krasner points out that regimes are standards of behavior defined in terms of rights and obligations. So basically, the way we interact, the rules and obligations with each other that sort of loosely define how we interact. And multilateral institutions like the UN, the AU, NATO, EU, any of those, that also plays a large role in this as well. These rules are usually formalized in international agreements, and these iterations of these things and more interaction plays out in these organizations as well. So when you think of institutions, you can also think of organizations, but don't rule out just the interactions in general that we're talking about. It's important to note, as we're talking about multilateral institutions, that it's not the organization itself that compels states to obey these rules or these institutions. States are still acting rationally in their own security interests. It's just in their interest to utilize these organizations, and we'll talk about why that's true in a minute. So, while realism is a negative theory and liberalism is more of a positive theory, they actually agree on quite a few things. So, both realist and liberal institutionalists agree that the states are the primary units in the international system, and basically use that as the base level of study. They also both agree that the international system is anarchic, and that has quite a bit of an effect. They're both structural theories. They also agree that states are self-interested, rational actors. And lastly, they agree that states wish to maintain security so they're able to ensure survival. So this is a fixed interest of security. It's something they want, and that's unchanging. The distinction between realism and liberal institutionalism, however, is that they believe that processes, such as the interactions and institutions between the states, can overcome some of the competitive aspects of the anarchic system. Liberals also believe that states can learn from past mistakes and from past negative interactions or positive interactions to learn from those things and progress past conflict. Institutionalists argue that states benefit from cooperation due to their harmony of interests, or the idea that nation and people share common interests. You know, U.S., we want this. You know, we want a good immigration policy. Mexico, you want a good immigration policy. All right, let's cooperate. We have a harmony of interests in which we're trying to resolve here. Also, let's talk about absolute gains a little bit. So we talked about the neo-realist concept of relative gains, in which states calculate their gains and losses in relation to the wins and losses of other states. Counter to that, liberal institutionalism argues that states just want to make gains. Everyone just wants to win. Even if an international transaction allows multiple parties to benefit, this is preferential to no transaction taking place at all. States merely want to advance their interests without regard to whether or not others are benefiting. So states use their common interests that make agreements that maximizes the benefits for everybody. It's not, oh, if we both win, you might win more than I do. You know, if so an example, so if the U.S. is entering into some economic treaty with another country, well, we already have footing, so it's going to help you more than it helps us to boost your economy, right? Liberal institutionalists would say, hey, we're both benefiting. You're, you know, getting our access to our products, we're getting access to your goods or services. It's all good. So as I noted before, this theory is a little more positive as it doesn't think conflict is inevitable. And I want to clarify that liberal institutionalists do think conflict can happen. There is an impetus for conflict. However, they just think it's more likely that that can be de-escalated through cooperation and through institutions, as opposed to, nope, they're going to war, there's nothing that we can do, cooperation is going to fail, so we're all screwed. So a little more positive. The biggest threat to successful cooperation is the threat of cheating. And so for example, when the U.S. and Russia sign START treaties or treaties to decrease their nuclear arsenals, the threat is that one state is going to be like, okay, cool, yeah, we're going to decrease our nuclear arsenals. And the other's going to say, yeah, we'll do that. And then they don't, right? And then all of a sudden the other country is screwed. And they're a sucker because they get suckered in the deal. So the threat of cheating and the opportunities for cooperation are illustrated in the prisoner's dilemma. Have any of you seen this before or talked about this before? Okay, so some have, some haven't. The Prisoner's Dilemma was a game formulated by two Rand Corporation scientists in the 1950s, which serves to test and simulate outcomes of international relations. And you can also, this applies to a lot of different situations, but it applies really well to IR theory. And so think of two people, they commit a crime together, and they're taken in for questioning. And they're told they can either cooperate or defect. And these are the options they're given. They're trying to get points. So in the game, the two players are given the option to cooperate or defect without knowing what the other player is going to do. They're taken in for questioning by themselves. David Axelrod explains this really well in a piece where he presents this illustration of the prisoner's dilemma, so that if both cooperate, both receive 3 points. If one defects while the other cooperates, the defector gets 5 points, and the cooperator gets 0. So you see, for the players, the temptation is to defect, right? If you defect, it's all going to be good for you. Realists point out that under a realist calculus, the rational choice is defect. So in IR theory, the rational choice is to cheat because there's such a threat of being cheated yourself. And should the other player cooperate, you still are going to get the maximum amount of 5 points. And if they also defect, you still get 1 point. So you're still in an okay situation that's still preferential to the 0 points if you try to cooperate and the other player defects. However, if both defect, both do worse than if they had cooperated. And so cooperation results in the 3 points per player. So liberal institutionalists believe that cooperation is still a preferable choice, and applied to the international community, while there's a temptation, institutions can change states' calculations about how to maximize their gains to allow states to accept the second best options. All right, so this happens in a few ways. And if you want a great outline of these that I'm about to present, Mearsheimer has this really short piece called The False Promise of International Institutions, which is really helpful, lays these out really well, and also provides the realist response to them and the realist response to basically liberal institutionalism as a whole. So just to sum up real quick before we dive into those. So realists argue it's better to defect because you can't trust what the other person's do. The risk of cheating is too high because you just don't know what's going to go on. Whereas the liberal institutionalists, they say, that might be true if this game is just in a vacuum, right? But states have so many interactions with each other that say, if the prisoners are able to communicate with each other beforehand through cooperation or through the international community within institutions, then maybe it can overcome that threat of cheating, right? If you know the other person's not going to cheat, then that will change your calculation. So this happens in a couple ways. The first is institutionalized iteration. Basically, the number of times you interact or operate together under these certain rules. Rules increase the number of transactions between particular states over time, and this decreases any chance of cheating for a couple of reasons. First, cheating today means no cooperation on an issue that might benefit you tomorrow because the victim's probably not going to cooperate with you again if you just screwed them over. The second reason is that multiple iterations also creates a tit-for-tat strategy in which cheaters are punished by reciprocal cheating. And the last argument why this overcomes cheating is because having multiple positive interactions rewards states that have good reputations. So, for example, when you go onto eBay or Amazon and you see that someone has a really bad reputation, right? You don't want to do business with them because, you might get cheated. The product might show up broken or in a really bad situation. Same thing applies here, right? Having a good reputation increases the likelihood of other states wanting to do business with you or interact with you in some way to maximize gains for everyone. The second way that institutions overcome the threat of cheating is issue linkage. When states cooperate on a number of issues, this increases interdependence, which decreases the likelihood of cheating, because cheating in one area might mean retaliation in another issue area. So, example, when Russia invaded the Ukraine, we responded with sanctions, another issue area that might be problematic for a state. So states, they use the EU to cooperate on a number of areas, on the economy, but also on other issues, for example, immigration. So hurting a state in one, or cheating on a state basically in one area might result in retaliation in another issue area, And heck, maybe that issue area is much more important to you. The third and probably most intuitive way that institutions overcome the threat of cheating is by increasing the amount of information. Institutions allow for close monitoring, right? So if you're meeting with Russia all the time, you can say, oh, hey, how's that nuclear de-escalation going, right? And based on their answer, you have increased information flowing that decreases the risk of threats and a greater exchange of information. Cheaters are also much more likely to be caught when there's increased institutions, and also it means that victims get sort of an early warning so they can minimize the harms when they see that someone is going to cheat. Lastly, it reduces transaction costs. Basically, this just means cooperation is more efficient through institutions, so as opposed to having 30 different bilateral treaties with individual countries, the EU or other countries have these sets of norms or these common policies that make it a lot more efficient to have cooperation. It makes it much more effective and efficient that way. Let's talk about how liberal institutionalism is used in debate. So first, these arguments can be used really well to debunk some of those internal links and impact stories, as cooperation can fall back for that. Or has anyone heard the democratic peace thesis, that argument used, that democracies don't go to war with each other? That's a liberal argument. That's a democratic liberal argument. Argument of economic interdependence. Has anyone ever heard or read that in a debate? That countries whose economies are so interwoven and that level of cooperation is so high that hurting your enemy is actually hurting yourself, because if we went to war with China, then all of a sudden we would lose access to all those goods and that level of trade that we get from them. That is a commercial liberal argument. You can also use these arguments to try to form solvency arguments for cases or counterplans. Any other uses that y'all can think of? All right, cool. So that's liberal institutionalism. Does that make sense? Do you have any questions about that? No? Totally clear? You can always come find me later, too. All right, so lastly, we'll touch on this real quick. Constructivism. Constructivism, unlike institutionalism and realism, it's less an IR theory and more a social approach to international relations. This paradigm is a little less likely to help you out with debate, but it can be helpful in providing nuanced responses and supplementary analysis to realist or institutionalist claims. And it's cool, so there's that too. This type of thought might also help you understand critiques that question truths taken about the world. Have you ever heard of threat construction, the threat construction K? This is the idea that things aren't just necessarily objective facts, but that these realities are socially constructed and then reinforced. So both that particular position and constructivism as a whole argue that facts about the world are not fixed, they are constructed. Realists and liberals both argue that identities and interests of agents are fixed. Realists go as far as to say that anarchy creates this self-help system and these power politics, and that's just the reality of the situation, and there's nothing we can do about it. But in a short article by Alexander Wendt, I think it's called Anarchy is What States Make of It, he writes that self-help and power politics are institutions. They are not essential features of anarchy. Anarchy is what states make of it. So states can choose to operate in basically any way they so choose, and we'll talk about how they do that in a second. These structural factors, the structure of the anarchy doesn't necessitate exactly what a state will do, and it doesn't constrain state behavior either in particular ways. The international system, according to constructivists, is merely comprised of actors within a given environment acting according to their identities and interests. This is due to the fact that states do not exist in isolation, but they position themselves in a unique role in relation to other international actors. Martha Finnemore, a constructivist, points out in her book National Interest in International Society that states are embedded in dense networks of transnational and international social relations that shape their perceptions for the world and their role in that world. So according to constructivism, states are not forced to act according to a certain state of nature in which it's inherently competitive. They just act, and they act according to their identities. But what do constructivists think motivates actors? Well, interests are socially constructed. I think it was Martha Finnemore that said, interests aren't just out there waiting to be discovered by the states. They are processed by the states and created and reinforced by the states. These interests are socially constructed based on an actor's identity, unlike the fixed interests of acquisition of power or gains. Actors act based on a logic of appropriateness, based on their role in the international system. What is appropriate for my role as the United States? What is my logic of appropriateness for my role as a leader in the world? And states act towards things on the basis of what meaning other actors have for them. And this is why we'd act differently towards the same policy coming from Iran as we would from Canada, because those actors have very different meanings that we have constructed. And as actors take actions, as in terms of policies, this is in turn reflected back into the culture, as this option becomes normalized within the state, and this forms a part of the actor's identity. And this is why constructivism is a reflectivist theory, not a rationalist theory. So think about if the U.S. stopped thinking of itself as a global leader, right? I think the U.S. has for quite some time seen itself, and perhaps the world has seen it as the global hegemon, right? But that is something constructed, and we act based upon the logic of appropriateness of what we think is appropriate for a global hegemon, how they should act. But if one day we just thought our identity was something different, you can see how that would totally change the policies. And you can see how the policies where we say we're the global leader, we have to go out and save the world, we have to be the global police force, how then those policies get shaped back into our culture, and then, you know, the collective conscious is like, yeah, we are the leader, and so it's kind of self-reinforcing. It creates and reinforces itself. One unique thing about constructivists is they also don't accept the state as the only unit of study in international relations, because states are also constructed by people. If everyone on the earth went extinct, it's not like states would just exist, right? The little borders drawn on the earth, they're constructed by people. Some constructivist theorists are John Ruggie, Alexander Wendt, and Martha Finnemore. So that's all I'm going to pretty much say about constructivism. I already discussed how it's applied to debate. But do y'all have any questions? That one's a little trickier to understand. All right, well, I would definitely recommend reading Anarchy is What States Make of It. It's only like 36 pages, and it's like, oh, okay, this makes sense. Also, the introduction to Martha Finnemore's book, National Interest in International Society, you can read, 10, 20 pages and have a pretty good understanding. So if it doesn't make perfectly clear sense, I would recommend that. All right, so last couple minutes here, we're going to discuss U.S. leadership. So the role of the U.S. in World War II, expansionist policies after World War II, and Cold War victory basically solidified the role of the U.S. as a hegemon. And a hegemon is defined by Patrick Callahan as the ability for a nation or a group of nations to dominate other nations through military, economic, and diplomatic means. Global hegemony has been made possible due to advances in transportation, military, and communications technologies. These are just things that make it easy. You get much easier to travel, much easier to have policies that are expansionist and abroad, and much easier for us to project our power as well. So now I just kind of want to have a discussion about these 4 questions about what factors or actions have secured U.S. power. What are some things that secure U.S. power? Go for it. Anyone?
Our military.
Our military, absolutely. We have the largest, most advanced military in the world. In fact, I have this little chart here where that demonstrates, this is from this year, that the U.S. spent $640 billion on the military per year. And this is more than the next 8 countries combined. And we're always looking for ways to further advance our military interests and further our military interests. And we love projecting that around the globe in ways that countries may or may not be so fond of. So the military. What else?
Trade connections.
What's that?
Trade connections.
Trade connections. The economy is a good one. Just the economy as a whole, we've got the largest GDP, our currency. The dollar is used in quite a few different sectors to ensure that those sectors stay stable in international trade. We definitely have a lot of trade agreements with other countries, and certainly, yeah, that's a huge factor. Anything else? Politically, the U.S. tries to have very strategic political alliances throughout the globe in which we're able to secure power, so we can, build things like drone bases and have access to resources. So political alliances and politics is a way that we have secured our power. We also export our ideology and our culture through we basically determine the discourse and what's acceptable of discourse in international relations. Through our trade, that also expands sort of our ideas and our culture to other countries. We also have quite a bit of control over multilateral institutions, and this is one thing that realists would say, well, institutions, those are just basically arenas for power politics to play out, right? The U.S. is still going to control the UN. It's just a talk shop for power politics to play out. So this is another way the U.S. is able to sort of have more control, is through utilizing these institutions to their benefit. And often that's just because we contribute the most resources, although certainly there are institutions that the U.S. does not have control of. That's a pretty good list. There's certainly other things as well, but those are some of the big ones. So what factors or actions have limited U.S. power? What are some things that have maybe made other countries not like us so much in the recent history? Or
over-involvement.
What's that?
Over-involvement.
Over-involvement, yes. Iraq and Afghanistan, not necessarily the most popular wars. Our use of drones, particularly in Pakistan, very incredibly unpopular. Just the idea of preemptive wars in general, or the Bush doctrine, in which we can just choose an enemy, and because they might have some immediate threat to our security, then we can invade them. There's also this idea of exceptionalism, in which the rules somehow do not apply to the U.S. the way they do to other countries, just because we are the hegemon. And this is something we use to justify unilateral policies. Unilateral meaning they're basically independent policies. Similarly to this is imperialist policies, or certainly policies that are perceived as imperialist. There is a lot of discussion about Western meddling in other countries and other portions of the globe, where, justifiably or not, we have spent quite a bit of resources and time in other countries and not respecting their sovereignty necessarily. All right, those are some limiting factors. What about threats that exist to challenge U.S. power? What about countries? What about countries that might challenge U.S. power?
China.
China, yes. In debate, you will talk a lot about the U.S. and China and their relation to each other. You see China's economy is poised to surpass the U.S. And China, they've got a lot of power. And so Obama actually, a couple years ago, had the Asia pivot to try to counter some of that power. But yes, so China, you might say Russia is a challenge to U.S. power. Certainly, Russia choosing to have conflicts with Georgia previously, or Ukraine, that is certainly, a bold move, which the U.S. has had limited response to. But basically saying you're not the global police force, or if you are, come challenge us. That's how it might be perceived, particularly for realists. So other countries pose challenges to the U.S. What about non-governmental organizations? Like terrorist groups, right? All these theories that use the state base as, we have to study countries and how countries might invade other countries. Well, things have modernized a little bit, and it's not necessarily always the state government that can challenge U.S. power. As we saw, 9/11, I'm glad Sarah Risberger's not here to say it was an inside job, although if that's your opinion, all right, for sure, cool. But I will say terrorist organizations certainly play a large role in challenging U.S. power, and how when we have gone to other countries to try, for our war on terror, to try to take that down, it's not proved quite so easy as we've expected in our policy. And when I say we, I don't know why I say that. U.S. policy is what I mean by that. And lastly, just how do we discuss U.S. power in debate? What does that look like?
Hedge good, hedge bad.
Hedge good, hedge bad. Yeah, that is a very clear and simple explanation of what we do, right? So you might have an advantage that talks about how hedge is low in the status quo in this particular area, but it's absolutely key. And so your link says the plan is necessary to be able to, do whatever this thing, whether it's have this awesome weapon or have this foreign policy option, whatever it is. And then there's also impacts that can demonstrate why hegemony is a good thing, whether it's, you're using the balance of threat or balance of power theory to talk about balancing the other countries or influencing other countries, checking Iran, checking rogue nations, as it might be called. So yeah, and you can also see critiques or even maybe some disads that say hedge is not necessarily such a good thing. And when we talk about hedge, usually we're talking about power projection in the form of hard power, or military power. But this also can include, we might talk about soft power or policies that influence other countries, that allow us to use our diplomatic means to influence other countries, make them appear, make us appear more attractive to other countries. And this is not necessarily, or it should not be coercive. Hard power is more of a coercive mechanism. It might also be, as Joseph Nye points out, smart power, which is a combination of those two things. So talk a lot about different types of power. All right, well, it looks like we're about at time. Yeah?
Is soft power kind of a constructivist argument then, if it's about like the identity that we construct?
I think you can, I think different theories approach soft power in different ways, right? So the institutionalists might argue that soft power is key, diplomacy, in these arenas to help build that type of power, whereas constructivists might say, we have to use that as part of our identity. A part of our identity is leveraging these types of things, and it would say that that is constructed. So yeah, I think it can be, and it can play a role there. I had something else I was going to say, but then I totally lost it. So.